Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. Back in 2022, we did a show with the great historian William Dalrymple on India, on the Anarchy, his best-selling book at the time, A History of the East India Company, which I've always found particularly fascinating. The book has won all sorts of awards. It has almost 9,000 positive reviews on Amazon, quite an achievement. And Dalrymple himself is quite an achiever, very successful, best-selling writer, all
very
sorts.
Sweet, Andrew, thank you.
Well, I got to say it, otherwise I wouldn't have you on the show, William. And many of you will also know him from his brilliant podcast, Empire, which he puts on in the same stable as the rest of history. And I'm thrilled that William has a new book out. It's already a New York Times bestseller, The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World. William is joining us from Washington, D.C. William, let me start with a personal question. You argue that ancient India transformed the world. How has India transformed William Dalrymple?
Oh, I think completely. I came from a very sort of backwoods Scottish childhood. That in retrospect seems almost sort of thing you see in sort of Chekhov's Cherry Orchard, the sort of pre-modern world I grew up in rural Scotland. Very happily, I have to say. I was very lucky to have the rural background that I did on the beach in Scotland. And through a whole series of accidents, I was always interested in the Middle East, Iraq, and dig there. But anyway, Saddam Hussein closed down the British School of Archaeology, saying it was a nest of British spies, which it probably was, and which I it probably wasn't before I got there. And so I ended up just going with a friend to India, and it was a completely transformative experience. I mean, it's the year off that never ended. I went aged 18. I'm now 60, and I'm still living there. I'm very much writing and talking and looking at the same sort of thing I was when I was 18, which is the extraordinarily rich history of ancient India, which has been a lifetime study for me, and I still haven't sort of tackled even the quarter of it. There's so much there, and actually so little that's written in a accessible way in English, and so it's been a lifetime obsession. Trying to make this better known and get it out there.
You're also the co-founder of the Jaipur Literary Festival, which I've always thought if I interview enough times, maybe you'll invite me one year.
You should come, Andrew, definitely.
I've got you on tape now, William. You can't get out of it.
Yeah.
How are you viewed in India? You're currently in the US, in Britain, as a kind of treasure. How do they? I know it's a generalization. But are you a complicated figure from the perspective of India, this British aristocrat who reinvents themselves in India and then makes a glittering career around telling the Indian story?
Well, it should be complicated, and the way you express it makes it sound as if it is complicated. But I have to say, I have had a most blissful 40 years living in India, and this book, The Golden Road, has been, well, it was until about 3 weeks ago, the #1 bestseller for over 6 months on the Indian bestseller list, which I've never had before. And so, no, I mean, it's a much much more full-on thing in India than anywhere else in the world. I mean, it's the only place in the world where I'm recognized in public, you know, and people will come up to me in airports and stuff. So no, that's where I've made my life, and that's where my books are most widely read. And I think I'm probably the best-selling historian in India. And of course, you know, I'm a Brit from the former colonial power, living in a country that was brutalized and looted by the British for 300-400 years, and much of its wealth siphoned off for much of that time. And so, you know, inevitably there will be people who will regard me with suspicion, and I'm kind of, in some cases, guilty until proved innocent. But particularly this book, I have to say, which is my first book about ancient India in the kind of pre-Islamic era, is one that's gone down particularly well in India. In a sense, it tells the Indians what they want to hear, so it's not surprising it's done well. And
what do they want to hear then? What do Indians want to hear? I mean, this book, and why have they found what they wanted to hear in your new book, The Golden Road?
Well, there is a entirely justifiable perception in India that India was one of the great civilizations of the world, up there with ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, ancient China, and that in the course of the last 1,000 years, India lost its way, that it was conquered first by a succession of Central Asian warlords, and then by the British, and that India today, in that perception, is recovering from what the Prime Minister calls 1,000 years of slavery. And I wouldn't accept that at all, because I think the Mughal Empire was a far more indigenized empire than is made out in that Hindu nationalist narrative that I just sort of outlined. The Mughals allied with the Raj generals of the Mughal armies that were thundering around India, conquering everything. So I certainly wouldn't agree with that. But what this book does is that it recreates and talks about the greatness of ancient India, which, you know, it is an extraordinary thing that in the 21st century we know a little about ancient Egypt. You know, names like Cleopatra and Ramesses II are very widely known in the West. Likewise, thanks to the narrative of the Silk Road, we have quite a good idea of ancient China as a major economic hub, with caravans, you know, full of silks and spices, crossing the Pamirs and swaying over the sand dunes of the Gobi Desert and all that sort of stuff. But somewhere in the mix, the greatness of ancient India, which I argue in this book is absolutely the equal of any of those, is not known. And just to give you one example, anyone listening to this show is probably likely to have heard about Archimedes in his bath shouting "Eureka" by the age of 7 or 8. Pythagoras and his theorem maybe by 10. And that is sort of universal human knowledge now, certainly in the Anglosphere, and really over quite a lot of the world. Now, there are in India absolutely equivalent figures who've done, in a sense, greater things for us today than either Archimedes or Pythagoras. Figures that 99% of people listening to the show who are not South Asian will never have heard of. One of them is Aryabhatta, who came up with the exact circumference of the Earth about 300 AD, who came up with the distance from the Earth to the Moon almost exactly at the same time, and who then worked out that we lived in a heliocentric universe. In other words, we revolve around the sun 1,000 years before Galileo. His pupil, who was a guy called Aryabhatta, it was a guy called Brahmagupta, came up with 0 and the place value and the number system we all use today. When we use the 9 symbols that we call Arabic numbers, that is an Indian invention that made it from India to the Arab world in the 8th century. We know the exact date that these ideas arrived, 776. These Indian books are received formally by an embassy in Baghdad. And so, you know, when you look on the laptop in front of you, if you're looking at this pod on a laptop, or on the keyboard of your phone, if you're looking at it on a phone, those numbers that we use every day without thinking about, that we call Arabic numbers, transformative and extraordinary Indian inventions in the history about that. We don't associate it with India, and we don't know that India had this influence on our life. This world phone numbers, my number is XVCCM, or trying to do long multiplication with those numbers, which is a much more difficult thing. And this extraordinary civilization-turning invention is something that came out of ancient India, arrived with us via the Arabs, and which we haven't associated in the modern era at all with Indian genius. And so there's a whole range of ideas like that, the spread of Buddhism, the spread of Hindu ideas of kingship and medicine and literature and language, that most obviously transformed Asia. The whole of Asia was completely changed by an Indian idea, Buddhism, and the ideas associated, was profoundly changed by Indian math, science, and mathematics.
You mentioned The Silk Roads, actually another best-selling book by Peter Frankopan. Peter's been on the show. As it happens, it comes, its front page has a blurb from a certain William Dalrymple. Is there, William, you're a distinguished historian, academic and popular. Is there a kind of an ideology or a historiography at the heart of these kinds of books? You're a man of the left, but you're not a Marxist. This is not some sort of Marxist interpretation of history.
Not.
But it does present the world in almost sort of classic British civilizational terms, doesn't it?
Well, first of all, about Peter. Peter is a very close friend, and this book very much came through conversations with Peter on 3 or 4 continents over many years, and I loved his book. But I also found that it omitted India by and large, not completely, but very much, largely. And he focuses, and he also talks about the Silk Road. Now, I had always assumed when I was growing up that the Silk Road was this sort of ancient idea that's in all the classical sources and so on. Bullshit. It's actually invented by a German geographer called Baron von Richthofen in 1877. English listeners will probably recognize the name von Richthofen because of the Red Baron, the flying ace of the First World War, who used to be a figure of children's comics when you and I were growing up. Well, the Red Baron was this guy's grandson. And he, in 1877, came up with a thing that he called the Seidenstraßen, the Silk Roads. And this enters the English language in 1936. And it doesn't really have much traction until as late as the 1980s, when I'm at college, and you get a show at the Met in New York, which I'm sitting opposite today, and I'm speaking at later today. And you get another show in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and suddenly this idea is off, and it's such a romantic idea. The idea of silk passing with camels over sand dunes. It's an idea that works both in a scholarly way and in a popular sense. It can, work for Netflix with Marco Polo being played by some handsome Italian actor, and this idea has taken over the world. It's now widely accepted. It's become a geopolitical fact because the Chinese have based the Belt and Road on this concept. And it's my contention in this book that the Silk Road really is a complete myth before the Mongol period, which is the kind of 13th century, when Genghis Khan punches a hole through the middle of Asia, knocks out Persia, and links the Mediterranean with the South China Sea. Before that, you never had any direct travel at all. And in the ancient period, which is what I'm writing about, China and Rome had no conception of each other's ideas, others' existence. There was a vague rumors about a city called Theiss, where silk came from in Rome. There was a vague story about Daquin, which is probably Rome in Chinese sources. But there's no character who sets off from Chang'an and ends up in Rome, or anyone a trade mission from Rome that ends up in China that we know of. There's never been a single Roman coin hoard found in China. But these Roman coins are all over India because India was the Roman Empire's #1 trading partner. And this is an extraordinary omission, because we have in the classical sources Pliny saying very clearly that India is the drain of all the precious metals in the world, by which he means that India, it's rather a Trumpian concept that all the wealth of the West is flowing off eastwards to India. And the Romans do put up 30% tariffs at the Red Sea ports where Indian goods are coming in. There's two big ports. It's called Berenike and Myos Hormos. And there's a major customs barrier there where this 30%, some economic historians are now talking about it being a major source of income for the Roman Empire. Think Hadrian's Wall and the Rhine frontier being paid for by taxes on Indian merchants bringing in luxury goods like silk, cotton, ivory, nard, all sorts of other good things from the Middle East and ultimately from India. Sorry, I'll say it again. Bringing in luxury goods from India to the Roman Middle East, to Egypt. And it's a myth that Rome and China were ever in direct contact. So how have we ended up in the 21st century with this very popular notion of an ancient Silk Road that from eternity has linked East and West, when in actual fact, the biggest trading partner of the Roman Empire is India, a completely different part of the world. And not only was Rome trading with India, according to Strabo, there were fleets of 250 vessels leaving the Red Sea in enormous flotillas and heading with the monsoon winds all the way to India. So it's a very considerable omission in our understanding of how the world worked. And on the back of all these traders come Indian ideas, and particularly that is true of what happens when Rome falls and then India pivots eastwards. And you have all these Indian sailors sailing to Southeast Asia. And at that point, you have Hinduism, Buddhism, Indian dance, literature, art, and architecture, all strongly becoming the basis for the architecture of Southeast Asia and the literature of Southeast Asia and the language of Southeast Asia. And you get a complete civilizational transformation, which again is simply not in our history books. So I'm asking for a substantial rethink about the place of India in the world. I'm saying that the Silk Road didn't really exist until the later Middle Ages, that the main focus of East-West trade is not China and Rome, but India and Rome, and it wasn't overland, but by the monsoon sea routes.
So that's your polite way of saying that Peter Frankopan was wrong and you were right.
Peter Frankopan is a far more sophisticated historian than to disagree with any of these ideas, but he has focused on a different.
No, and I'm teasing you.
There are others.
I know you're close friends with Peter. But in terms of my second question, and this telling of history, William, you could have easily, had you been 20 years older, you probably would have spent your career teaching at Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard. You've become a popular historian, a very successful popular historian. The book, as you said, has been a bestseller in India for months. It's already on the New York Times bestseller list. Your podcast does incredibly well, has tens of thousands of viewers a day. Is this the kind of history that people want to hear? I'm sure you had contemporaries, undergraduate contemporaries, who were locked in some academic position writing obscure treatises which about five people read. You've chosen, excusing, yours is more of a golden road, certainly, than the traditional academic one. Why do people want to read these histories? Is it because they're true, or because they're a little bit more dramatic or more interesting or richer?
So I regard myself not as a popular historian, but someone that.
And I don't mean that in a patronizing or critical way. No. I mean it in a complimentary manner.
No, it's a very reasonable question, and it seems to me that you have a choice as a historian. You can choose to teach, or you can choose to focus on writing, and I've chosen the former. I have the greatest respect for those who teach both at school and at university level. And most of us that have ended up with interesting jobs in the arts have got some amazing English teacher or history teacher that inspired them at an early age. But I have always wanted to write. Writing is my thing. That's what I have always wanted to do. That's always what I feel is my gift. I enjoy my podcast, but I wouldn't regard it as the thing I want to be remembered for, or actually what my main talent lies in. And I remember having a conversation with my hero, the great Crusader historian, Sir Stephen Runciman, who's actually also the great hero of Peter Frankopan too. We both very much.
And he's the father, isn't he the father of David Runciman? Uncle, yeah.
He's
an
the
excellent podcaster.
He was gay and
friend of mine.
very definitely had no children, but yeah, same family. And Stevens left Trinity College, Cambridge, which was my old college, because he said he wanted to write. He said these are two different jobs. You know, you can teach or you can write, but it's quite difficult to do both well. And you end up skimping on one or the other if you try and do the two someday, particularly in modern British academia, where an awful lot of it is about academic institution building and administration of university departments and filling in paperwork and so on. And I managed to write 12 big fat history books by the age of 60 by not having to do that. I mean, as I say, I have the greatest respect for people who do teach the next generation and bring them forward. But I feel my calling is a different one, which is to write. And just because you choose to publish in a non-academic press, I published with Bloomsbury, doesn't seem to me that you in any sense undermine the academic rigor or value of what you do. This book has got 120 pages of footnotes to primary sources in several languages. And I've had, and I wrote it in All Souls College, Oxford, the final draft of it. And so I would hope that my work is regarded as seriously as any historian with a university birth. But it's definitely aimed at the sort of intelligent reader that might read an Arundhati Roy or a John Updike or a Salman Rushdie novel, the non-specialist who's interested in these things, and it's written in accessible language. The method that I've developed, which is cribbed from Stephen Runciman, is basically to keep your academic arguments to the footnotes. So you tell the story as you think it happened in the main narrative in an accessible way, and hopefully an exciting and interesting way. And then you have 120 pages of footnotes where you have all the academic tussles, and you say, well, I've gone down on this side on this argument, but X thinks this, Y thinks that, and here's why I think X is right. So it results in a kind of book that's hopefully very accessible, fun to read, but which has the same academic rigor as any university press endorsed.
But people want to read this stuff, don't they? Which, I mean, you wrote a piece for The Guardian last year about, and I'm quoting the title, "In Britain, we're still astonishingly ignorant," as an introduction to your story of how ancient India shaped the world. That may be true, but people don't want to be ignorant. That there is an appetite for being educated about these big subjects, isn't there?
There certainly is, and the fact that podcasts like my podcast Empire, which I do with Anita Anand, or Tom Holland's wonderful Rest is History podcast, are being downloaded by kind of 1 million people a week. Slightly more than 1 million for Tom, slightly less than 1 million for me, but the same sort of figures. Shows that there's a massive appetite here, and that this idea that the younger generation or people in general have low attention spans and want all their information in a 1 minute, dense info burst, I think is strongly disproved by the fact that these podcasts are being downloaded in their millions across the globe. I'm just on book tour at the moment in the States, and I've been in places that I've never, barely heard of before. Like, I've heard of St. Louis, but I've never visited it before. And we're getting, 300 or 400 people turning up on a weekday night in a small provincial library to hear this stuff, because they listen to the podcast and they have an appetite for sitting through an hour-long discussion on a subject that interests them. Obviously, they're not going to listen if you talk in academic jargon. Obviously, they're not going to listen if you talk deliberately over their heads in language they don't understand. But if you, use full academic rigor to express ideas in an accessible manner, they will pile in. And I think I think this podcast boom, particularly the podcast in the more serious end of history, is a great demonstration of how we underestimate people. It's simply not true that the younger generation are not reading books, that they have no interest in ideas, that the whole world of academe and intellectual life is dying. And I would say that we are the
I agree. And I think when I think of guys like yourself and Holland and David Runciman, it seems as if you guys represent the spirit of the old BBC without the bureaucracy, without the annoying rules and procedure and politics of large bureaucracies and corporations.
Well, I think Tom Holland is very much of the view that he and Dominic, two white males, middle-aged, bald, talking to each other about sort of Anglo-Saxon history, wouldn't be given, 2 minutes on the BBC. And yet here they are, the biggest podcast in the world. I suppose Anita, being a woman of color from India, and I would be a more BBC-friendly format. But ditto, this is something which has made a massive hit across the world. We did a series on Ireland that made us the #1 podcast in Ireland last month. When we're talking about China, we're #1 in Hong Kong and Singapore. As it turns out, and I wasn't really aware of this, we're now growing to be one of the biggest history podcasts in the US, with large audiences all over the place. And it's a very exciting thing. It's lovely. And it's done very much. I mean, we definitely try and be funny. We definitely try and be interesting, and we definitely try not to be obscure. But there's no question of dumbing down. We did a 30-part series on the Mughal Empire. We did an equally large series on the Ottomans, and tackling tricky subjects which a mainstream broadcaster would be loath to touch, such as the expulsion of the Palestinians from what became Israel in 1948, the Armenian genocide in 1917. Podcasts allow you to tackle subjects which often mainstream broadcasters are nervous of doing, and I think,
as you say, you're doing a tour, a victory tour of the United States. You're in St. Louis. You've got 400 people. What's your take? I know you're not an expert on the US, but you've been here for 2 weeks. You've been in DC, Houston, Dallas, St. Louis, Boston. You're currently in New York. What's your take, William? And I know you're not an expert, but I'm actually, that's the point of the question. As an intelligent tourist, the guy who obviously knows a lot about the world, is it quite as dire in your view as some people are presenting things? I mean, you're a man of the left, so you're obviously no fan of MAGA or Donald Trump.
Exactly. So no, I arrived here half expecting to be shut out because there's kind of hysterical coverage in the West about people who tweeted in favor of Gaza or show any interest in.
Yeah, and you're not shy on Gaza. I'm not outspoken on that front.
I'm very outspoken about that. I spent a lot of time in the West Bank, and I know a lot of people in Israel and Palestine, and I'm very strongly for a two-state solution, and think that this idea of turning Gaza into a holiday resort for the rich of the region is a terrible idea, as any ethnic cleansing is anywhere in the world. So yes, I'm very outspoken about that, and I'd half expected from watching the news coverage that on arrival at the border there'd be some guy at Homeland Security saying, "We've seen your tweets, go home." Far from it. It walked in, and I had the shortest immigration queue I've ever had at Dulles, and a very friendly guy sitting beside the computer. I've spoken. I mean, I think inevitably on a book tour, you are in a liberal bubble, and the kind of people who are turning up are middle class, upper middle class liberals and intellectuals who read books. My audiences have a heavy South Asian weighting because I'm writing about ancient India. I mean, the place that you felt very strongly the shadow of MAGA was Washington, where I bumped into many people who just lost their jobs.
Yeah, I mean, you've done stuff at Brookings, at Carnegie, so you've been in all the think tanks.
Yeah, and there is a real feeling of fear in Washington. I think people are very shaken up. I mean, I'm staying in a Republican household here in New York, and I've just had a breakfast discussion with two close friends who voted Trump and view this as a necessary shakeup. So I'm certainly coming away less appalled and less terrified than I was from the view outside the country. I mean, life, as so often anywhere in the world, just goes on. And much is not changed. But I'm not a fan of this government in the slightest. And I think it's very foolhardy of America to throw away alliances that have been built up with years of diplomacy. And I think America is losing a lot of goodwill among friends and supporters at a time when China is rising and there are options in the world. You don't have to be part of the American team anymore. There are many other ways of using your diplomatic choices than there used to be. And I think that America is losing a lot of soft power by cutting away things like USAID and Voice of America. It seems to me a very foolish turn that America has taken, but I'm not an American, and I'm sure America will draw its own conclusions as the markets tumble and friends begin to look on America with more and more suspicion and regard it as less and less a reliable ally, or indeed the dollar as a reliable currency. So no, I'm a lefty. I'm not going to enjoy MAGA, obviously. But I don't think it's the end of the world. I think America will continue, and it'll still be certainly one of the three big economies by the end of the decade. The question is which is the order will be. Is it going to be China at the top? Is it going to be America? Or conceivably, could it be India, which is going to overtake? It's now currently the fifth biggest economy in the world. It overtook Britain a couple of years ago. It's going to overtake Japan and Germany in the next decade. And I think America needs to wake up to the fact that not only is it the only game in town, but the world is swinging back to the way the world has always been up until a couple of centuries ago, which is sort of 70 or 80% of the world's GDP coming out of Asia.
Of course, that's the story in some ways of the Golden Road. What does that
and the anarchy in a different way? Because the anarchy is about the East India Company, who were the first European attempt really to do the opposite, to transfer the wealth of Asia to Europe, and the way that the East India Company, which was a multinational corporation, it was the world's first great multinational corporation, and that went out of its way to transfer the wealth of India into European pockets. When you walk around large country houses owned by the National Trust often now, and go and take tea at some large house where you could imagine Colin Firth swimming through the lake in his breeches and emerging to court some lady in a bonnet. Quite often, those houses turn out to have been built by East India Company merchants who did terrible things in India and basically stole the wealth of India and brought it back to the home counties. But what we're seeing now in the world is the rebalancing of the world after that era of colonialism. It's now 77 years, I think, since India gained independence, and very soon it'll be back to the position it was before Robert Clive fought the Battle of Plassey.
Yeah, it always strikes me that John Stuart Mill worked for the East India Company. I don't know what that tells us about the history of liberalism. But William, you mentioned these three great powers, India, China, the United States, jostling for economic, political, cultural, military domination of the 21st century. If Modi and Trump and Xi read the Golden Road, I'm sure Modi has, I don't suppose Trump or Xi have, what would they learn from ancient India about transforming the world, about dominating this new Asia-centric global world of the 21st century?
Well, the striking lesson, in a sense, of the Golden Road is that India's power in antiquity and its transformative effect on all the countries around it, including the West, took place entirely peacefully. Unlike the story of the spread of Christianity to Latin America in the 16th century, or unlike the story of the spread of Islam across Persia and India in the 7th and 8th centuries, 9th centuries, the spread of Buddhism, the spread of Hinduism, and the spread of Indian ideas took place without the jackboot, without the sword, without the spear. It's an empire of the spirit. And that is a rare thing in human history, but it's not unique. And I think it shows. Joseph Nye, who invented the term soft power, died only this week.
Yeah.
But it shows, I think, the story of India is a very good example of how countries can act as catalysts for change without invading each other, without using threats and brutality and force to spread their ideas. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that ancient India was some sort of Eden. There was wars and bloodshed and massacres in India aplenty, as there have been in every period of human history. But it is a fact that Indian ideas spread, for example, to Southeast Asia by means of merchants and monks, not by armies and generals. And it's a very interesting example of how ideas, through their very sophistication, can transform whole regions in a way that we sometimes forget.
Finally, William, I want you to get back to your MAGA hosts in New York. The Wall Street Journal review, which all your reviews have been, as always, outstanding, talks about India at history's center. India is back the center this week and the last few days in this new conflict between India and Pakistan. You're not a geostrategic thinker, but should we be concerned about this in your view? You live in India, you're familiar with the ethnic military conflict between Pakistan and India. Is this something that reflects the new disorder in the world, to borrow the title of another popular podcast?
I'm certainly extremely anxious about it. There is an unsolved border dispute that has been smoldering on and off into warfare between India and Pakistan over the region of Kashmir for 75 years. When my father was a kid, he got caught up in the first outbreak of that conflict when Pakistani irregulars, and so by that I mean sort of tribesmen armed by the Pakistan army but not recognized by them, crossed the border into a place called Baramulla, where they then ran amok and raped nuns and did all sorts of horrors. And ever since then, Pakistan, which is obviously much smaller than India and much less rich, has utilized irregular troops, which some people would call militants, some people would call terrorists, to cause chaos in Indian Kashmir. And this is what caused the first outbreak of this violence. There was a massacre in Kashmir at Pahalgam. 26 tourists were killed. They were first asked their faith. Muslims were sent away, and the Hindus were shot. And this was very much a deliberate move, apparently, by the Pakistan army establishment to a cry for attention, I think, because Pakistan has felt that it's been sort of left out of the mainstream under Trump. It used to be a crucial American ally when everyone was fighting in Afghanistan, but they've been slightly left to one side in the latest rounds. And my view on this, and this is one that many people in India and Pakistan might disagree with, but my view is that the Pakistan army is the principal problem here. It has chosen to use irregular troops, militants, terrorists, call them what you like, to solve it as its cat's paw for poking India for 77 years now. And this happened in 1947. It's happening today in 2025. And it's not as if India has been a complete angel in this story. There's been a great deal of repression in Kashmir the last 20, 30 years. There's been a very rough military rule for some of that time. A lot of Indian troops have been stationed, Pakistani boys rounded up, often tortured. And so neither side have behaved particularly well. And it's the Kashmiris at the end of the day who are getting it in the neck as you have shelling both ways over the border. As both these very proud countries flex their muscles. It's not good news. And the latest head of the Pakistan army does not sound a benign character. He is. I think he has behaved very unwisely, to put it very mildly. If he did authorize this Pahalgam attack, it seems not only immoral and an act of terrorism, but also extremely geopolitically foolhardy to kickstart this thing again. It could easily run. I mean, both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. This could run wildly out of control, and it certainly is a cause for deep concern. In general, what's happened in most recently is that people have intervened and in the international sphere, and ceasefires have been declared. But at the moment, I think both the Indian High Command and the Pakistanis are quite sort of bullish. And Vance has said that he doesn't want to intervene. So, no, I am anxious. I'm very anxious.
Well, South Asia is probably best off without Vance. I'm not sure he would be much help, would he?
Well, yes, in general, I would agree with that. But America has played a role as a trusted interlocutor in the past, and it would be a shame if they allowed this to spiral into a very serious conflict with land armies and all the rest of it, and possible nuclear weapons if it could be avoided.
And I just got to ask you this finally, William. I know you got to run. But does the Golden Road, is it a lesson for politicians, not just Trump, but also Modi, about toleration? We just talked about the increasing intolerance between a Muslim Pakistan and a Hindu India. Can we learn to live together globally and respect each other, not hate each other from this model of the Golden Road?
I would very strongly say yes, that it is possible to become extremely rich, to trade, to across open borders, and to spread ideas without the use of force. That's definitely what happened in India from about 250 BC to 1200 AD. So in that sense, yes, obviously we're living in a very different world, but the principles remain the same.
Well, there you have it. The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World. It's a bestseller everywhere. William Dalrymple is a best-selling author everywhere. Continue the great work, William, and I will see you in Jaipur. Thank you so much.
In Jaipur, or indeed in the West Coast in the fall.
Yeah, you're coming out on the West Coast. We'll do another interview in the fall, in September. Thank you so much, William.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.